So we're doing a series of videos here looking at what really are the key things that product leaders need to understand from a financial perspective. And woven into this is this concept that from a product manager's perspective, the atomic unit of the business is not the business or the organization overall, but the unit that all things are reflecting against is actually the product. And in the last video, we went through and talked about different revenue model patterns that map back to different types of products and how you can use that to have revenue model product fit. Once you have the right revenue model in place, the next key question is going to be, what really is the metric that ultimately reflects the health of my product? Or put another way, what is the one metric that everybody who cares about this product should know and should be thinking about how to optimize to make the product even more robust? And as many of you probably know, we often call this concept a North Star metric. And in today's video, what we really want to do is we want to walk through two things. First of all, we just want to give an overview of like, what do we mean by North Star metric? And then again, similar to what we did with the revenue model video, we want to go through and give some examples of North Star metrics. Okay, so what is a North Star metric? This is a quote from Sean Ellis. Most of you probably are familiar with Sean Ellis as one of the three guys who coined the term growth hacker. And so this quote talking about North Star metrics is very focused on how North Star metrics drive growth. But I think it does an excellent job, whether you're focused on growth or just overall robustness and health of your product, to think about North Star metrics from this lens. So I liked it so much, I kind of used it, even though certainly this has a little bit of a growth angle on it, and I have nothing against that. I literally wrote the book, The Science of Growth. So I'm totally good with that. But I think this concept of North Star metric is much bigger than that. And really, it's really the second sentence that I think becomes incredibly important here, which is when you think about a North Star metric, what you're trying to do is get everybody in your organization who cares about your product focus on optimizing that single metric because you believe it drives sustainable growth across your full customer base. So all these words are important, right? It's the single metric that leads to sustainable growth across the full customer base here. And so I think this is an important concept as we think about, what is the acumen from a finance perspective that a product leader needs to have. It's like, okay, well, if he's going to be talking to all these different groups, engineering, sales, operations, he wants to make sure that he can continue to point all those groups back to this single metric, this North Star metric. And I'll give you some common examples to get us started here now that we kind of have a little bit of a definition. Then we'll talk a little bit more about how you can come up with it. And then again, we'll come back to this much larger set of examples. So in the case of Facebook or Instagram, daily active users becomes an important North Star metric. For Airbnb, it's less about number of users on the platform, and it's more about the number of nights booked. The unit is not so much about users or engaged users, it's messages going back and forth. And similarly, Uber has another kind of consumption metric looking at the number of rides per week. If you think about why Uber is taking a weekly lens or whereas Facebook is using a daily lens, right? The reality is that there is seasonality, or seasonality is probably not the right term, but there is variance across the week on activity on the Uber platform. A Friday is going to have different volumes of activity than a Tuesday or Wednesday, right? So looking at rides across week, that's going to give you this constant metric that you can be looking at consistently. But each of these become kind of important. But you can imagine how being inside a place like Facebook or Airbnb or Uber, this single metric would be the kind of thing that all these different groups could point to and understand that as they're optimizing that metric, they're optimizing the health of the overall business. A handful of steps that you want to go through to come up with and develop your North Star metric. The first thing, and this is going to tie back again to what we talked about in the last video, you want to understand how your customers get value. If you don't understand the value that your customers are getting from the products or services that you're delivering, the rest of this becomes noise. Once you understand that and you can kind of think about, well, what are different ways that customers might articulate that value, it's really important that this be a metric which can consistently grow up and to the right. What I mean by that is it shouldn't be impossible to ultimately have it continue to grow. So for example, if your North Star metric was something like what percentage of users do something, you could imagine a world where 100% of your users do that, and now there's no way for that metric to get better. It can only get worse from there. That would be a bad North Star metric. You're looking for a North Star metric that can consistently grow up and to the right. You want to make sure you also think about what are the potential risks if you optimize this metric? Could it have unintended negative consequences other places? Remember, the things that you measure, people will optimize and they'll care about, but you want to make sure you're not encouraging them to focus on the wrong things. And finally, you want to keep it really simple. I'm sure that in each of the 4 examples I gave at the beginning here, you could have imagined a discussion on some much more complicated sets of North Star metrics here. But really, at the end of the day, something simple that everybody on the team can wrap their arms around is actually much more effective than a complicated metric that nobody really understands. Okay, so with that, now I want to give just a little bit of thought on different types of businesses and kind of common approaches to coming up with a North Star metric for each of those types. So we've gone through the steps. I think hopefully you have a sense on what we mean by the term North Star metric now. Now we want to kind of make it real by talking about some different businesses. This is slightly different than what revenue model they have, because in many of these cases, you'll have multiple different revenue models within a given type of business. And we'll even try to break out sometimes how different revenue models as a subset of these types of businesses may lead to different North Star metrics, but it'll give you a sense kind of like what are the important things to be focused on here. So marketplaces and platforms. We talked about this a little bit in the concept of marketplace revenue models, but if we were to kind of come back to this now where we're thinking about just as a type of business, right? The typical North Star metric here is going to be something around consumption. And if the way the revenue works is they're taking a cut of the transaction, i.e. they charge some percentage of the value exchanged, then it typically would be the volume of transactions. If it's a flat fee, maybe more like Twilio, then it's just the activity going on. But either way, North Star metrics for marketplace and platform businesses tend to be focused on kind of consumption of these marketplaces and platforms. If the business is a business where ultimately the way the business grows is through paid customer acquisition, then often the right North Star metric there is going to be something around efficiency, right? So if it's a physical product, like the subscription box companies, then maybe it's some type of margin efficiency, average order volume and orders per customer or something like that. If it's a digital product where the margins tend to be much higher, then it might just be overall marketing performance. This might be like lifetime value to CAC. And you can imagine how, again, if you think back to those things, while these are more complicated than one single number, they're still pretty easy to wrap your arms around, and they're metrics that you can continue to drive up and to the right. Okay, freemium and B2B businesses, right? So we talked about the freemium revenue model last time. Now we're looking at a subset of those where it's freemium in a business-to-business space. And in that situation, it's typically driven by paid customer growth. So when we say customer growth in this context, this is not counting the number of free users on the platform typically. Maybe at the beginning you do that, but over time it's typically the number of paid customers. So in Miro here, you can see they still have this concept of collaborative boards where you could imagine some people creating collaborative boards within the free account. But in Asana or in Slack, it's again, a paid user number, which as these freemium B2B businesses grow, tends to be the right North Star metric. If you have a media business where the revenue model is subscription, not ads, we'll talk about ads in a little bit. If it's subscription, then typically you're back again to something in the consumption space. So, Netflix is looking at median view hours over a given month. Loom is number of created videos. Twitch might be 5-minute plays, right? 5-minute being long enough that it's sort of showing meaningful consumption there. On the other hand, if you have a business which is advertising driven, so this is not subscription, but this is ad driven, then you're going to look at just coming back to engagement, right? Because remember, you're monetizing the attention of your users if you have a ad driven business model. And so things like daily active users in the case of Facebook or Snapchat, weekly active in the case of Pinterest, and monthly active in the case of Spotify. And again, you see here different lengths of time depending on how the customers are getting value from the given product and what's a reasonable length of time to look at as the unit of time here, daily, weekly, or monthly, in the examples on your screen now. If you have a consumer subscription business model now, this would be some type of engagement or customer growth overall. So this might be something like if you're active on the application Strava, where people post their cycling and running rides, it might be the monthly active users. In Patreon, this might be the number of creators making more than a certain amount of money. So in a weird way, this is kind of tying back to the same philosophy that you saw in Twitch with the 5-minute plays. But in the case of Patreon, it's like, look, if a creator's not making at least a certain amount of money every month, they haven't really hit that engaged customer growth level yet. Okay, so we've been through a number of these different examples now based on revenue model. We set it up front. I took you through 4 steps to figure out how to create one. Some of you may be thinking, and this is how we'll wrap the video up, well, isn't this the same thing as a one metric that matters or an OKR? And kind of, but not really. So for one metric that matters, or OMTM, when you're thinking about that, unlike North Star metrics, which have a very long time horizon, these one metrics that matter typically have much shorter time horizons, and they typically are constrained to one team. OKRs, on the other hand, typically would be 3 to 5 objectives, so not one thing. And typically the objective is a long time horizon, kind of like a North Star metric, but the key results would typically be, again, much shorter time horizon, like the one metric that matters. So certainly are some similarities here, but I think it really is a little bit different as well than one metric that matters or OKR. And I think just the concept here is that as a product leader, certainly this is not to say you shouldn't try to help bring efficiency to your teams through things like one metric that matters or having an OKR reporting system. That may make a lot of sense as well. But when we come back to this concept of what are the concepts about a product that sort of feel relevant from a product leader's perspective, again, what I believe is once you understand that revenue model, the next thing to think about is, okay, well, what is one metric, that one sort of North Star metric that I can continue to optimize to continue to drive growth across my product, and that because it can't ever reach 100% or it can't ever reach the peak, it's something that I can put in place, get all the different groups that I interface with rallied around, and ultimately have them all be optimizing. So I hope this helps. I hope between the revenue models and this, you're beginning to get a sense and thinking about the products that you're all responsible for. Would love to hear in the comments below maybe a North Star metric that works really well for you, or North Star metrics that you're considering applying.